was told to wait. Oh, well, it's working perfectly. Right, okay. My name's Vice Principal Professor Jeff Hayward. It's my pleasure to host this inaugural lecture this evening, given by Professor David Howarth. David was educated at Cambridge University, where he was an undergraduate, and then held research fellowships at Magdalen and Clare, and then followed by a PhD also in Cambridge on the origins of collecting and art patronage in modern England. He's had a career which has blended the academic and the conservation domains. National Trust of England as curator, 3 properties in the north of England, Hardwick Hall and Revo Abbey in Yorkshire, and then responsible for the National Portraits Gallery in London, hanging collections of 18th century paintings with a 2-year restoration project of a great Baroque house at Benningborough Hall in York. He came to Edinburgh in 1979, and his work has then concentrated on the patronage of the arts and the understanding of artifacts as historical documentation. He's involved with a number of exhibitions in Edinburgh and in London. His study of patronage in early modern Britain, Images of Rule, was shortlisted for the Longman's History Prize and the History Today Prize. And his later book on Iberia, called The Invention of Spain, is about the Anglo-American attitudes to Spanish culture from the Armada through to the Civil War. That book led on to his role as chief curator for the Discovery of Spain exhibition at the National Galleries of Scotland during the 2009 festival exhibition, which led him into an interest in the Duke of Wellington, about whom he's currently writing a book to coincide with the bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo, which will be in 2015. He advises the National Portrait Gallery on their exhibition plans to commemorate the same event. But his interests and his sympathies are wider than that. He has a scholarly and creative interest in 19th century culture. His first love has always been early modern Europe, and through his archival discoveries, he's transformed our understanding about the English career of Rubens' most famous pupil, Sir Anthony van Dyck. Currently, he's writing a biography of Rubens for Oxford University Press. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Professor David Howarth to give his inaugural lecture entitled Rubens and the Art of Friendship.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I feel I should be wearing a wig up here. I'm rather high up. Rubens as a painter, many find difficult. But then, so it has always been. The 18th century artist Henry Fuseli knew what might be termed the problem with Rubens, perhaps because he was guilty of the same muscular melodrama which so repelled him in the work of the earlier painter. In a lecture delivered in his capacity as Professor of Sculpture at the Royal Academy, Fuseli wrote of Rubens, and I quote, "His male forms are generally the brawny pulp of slaughtermen, his females hillocks of roses in overwhelmed muscles, with grotesque attitudes and distorted joints, which are swept along in a gulf of colours as herbage, trees and shrubs are whirled, tossed, and absorbed by inundation." Today, we express our reservations rather differently. Rubens comes decidedly second best to Rembrandt. By contrast to the lack of empathy with Rubens, we sympathize with Rembrandt. We observe approvingly a turbulent private life and its end in bankruptcy. But then, how much more sympathetic we would be if Rembrandt had had access to a credit card. There's romance, even heroism, associated with Rembrandt, but as for Rubens, many people are much less moved by his life of strict rectitude and complacent success. Surely, artists shouldn't be like Rubens. They need to be complicated and unhappy. The meaning of Rembrandt's self-portraits, that grand gallery of introspection, is hard to know. Though it has been suggested that through the aggressively autographic touch of the late self-portrait such as this, Rembrandt succeeds in establishing the self-possession of "I paint, therefore I am." Or, as the modern English poet Elizabeth Jennings put it in her poem Rembrandt's Late Self-Portraits, "To paint's to breathe, and all the darknesses are dared." If so, then surely these images must be seen as anything but defeatist and defeated. Whatever the truth, people have always preferred the apparent vulnerability of Rembrandt to the untouchable Rubens. However, what the neo-Stoic Panaetius described in relation to friendship as the virtues of magnanimity and generosity might be a more positive way of looking at Rubens and his magnanimous and generous art. Actually, I'm here to enthuse about Rubens, and that most life-enhancing aspect about him, his marvelously enduring friendships. What I want to do this evening, therefore, is to see how the friendships Rubens made can help us to get closer to him. For it was a genius for making friendships, which is a central but neglected aspect of understanding him. So my inspiration will not be primarily visual, but literary. It will consist less of looking at canvases than at opening letters. There has been much focus recently on artists' rooms. Perhaps it is time now to look at artists' letters. Indeed, the recent much celebrated publication in 8 volumes of the Van Gogh correspondence has been transformational. The first edition of a book which costs £450 is already out of print. Evidently, it has delighted Samuel Johnson's common reader. Though written in various languages and available in an excellent English translation since 1955, the letters of Rubens have never actually been scrutinized on their own terms. But then behind that one volume stands a truly monumental endeavor, which remains still more neglected. This is the Codex Diplomaticus, published in Antwerp between 1887 and 1909, and appearing in a mere 6 rather than the 8 volumes of the Van Gogh letters. Nevertheless, the Codex Diplomaticus, this mighty monument to Rubens, requires its own trolley in our special collections. Since it contains every document about Rubens then known, and since Rubens lived many lives, there is a huge number of items. Notwithstanding its authoritative presence, the Codex has been subjected only to open-cast mining rather than deep excavation, despite the richness of its seams. Even a cursory acquaintance with it, however, suggests the vast engagement Rubens made with the world of the early 17th century, aptly described by the late Francis Haskell as having had the broadest culture of any man in Europe. In truth, one could go further than Haskell's compliment and claim that Rubens is the most successful artist who has ever lived, though you will be relieved to hear that I am not about to make a fool of myself and embarrass you by claiming that he was the best. If we consider Rubens alongside the 3 Renaissance masters with whom he liked to compare himself, it is possible to gain a measure of his exceptional output and presence. We do not know how many altarpieces by Leonardo and his studio were shown in churches during the lifetime of the artist, but it is certain they could have been counted on one hand. Rubens, by contrast, managed 60 in 12 years alone. Leonardo was cajoled into going to France, an experience that may have been as unhappy as when Poussin in 1640, the year of Rubens's death, made the mistake of returning to his native country for 2 unhappy years. Titian got as far as Augsburg, repeatedly refusing, of course, to travel to Madrid to work for Philip II. As for Michelangelo and Raphael, with whom Rubens also competed, they never left Italy. By contrast, Rubens was the first European artist. For Rubens and the generation after his death, unlike Picasso, with whom one might be tempted to compare Rubens in terms of inexhaustible creative energy, there were no colour supplements, no Royal Academy shop, no Google, not even a Citroën car to be named after him. And yet, thanks to Rubens's prints and during his own lifetime, Rubens came to be admired from Copenhagen to Messina, with patrons in Madrid to the west, Freiburg in the east, Edinburgh in the north, and Naples to the south. But how was Rubens so successful? How did he do it? In some sense, he didn't, since much of what came out of his studio was painted by others. Take, for example, the National Gallery of Scotland Feast of Herod. To those who believe in the romantic notion of artistic genius, this comes perhaps as a grievous disappointment, for little is certainly his. Perhaps the head of Herodias, the head of Herodias is there, the nurse behind, and the figure of Salome in the red dress here, but not, I think, Herod, who reminds me more of a pugilist in a Punch and Judy show than a plausible biblical tyrant. Most of this great painting was the work of studio assistants. Perhaps the parallel here might be with today's international architects. They do not slave over finished drawings, they supply ideas only. And so it was with Rubens. Rubens would produce a coloured sketch such as this for others to work into a finished canvas. But besides the capacity for collaboration and his genius for time and office management, Rubens had a wonderful gift for friendship. For in him, we are confronted with an enormous personality, but paradoxically, one which was also critically dependent on others, not merely in terms of the studio, but in the wider world. That dependency was negotiated through his international network of friendships. Our concern this evening, then, is Rubens and the art of friendship, what it did for Rubens and what Rubens did with it. The centrality of friendship is attested by the significant number of what might be termed friendship portraits by Rubens, such as this, where you can see Rubens here. As for self-portraits, to use them for biography is rather like believing memoirs of politicians tell us what happened. Nevertheless, let's look at the celebrated self-portrait with Isabella Brandt, Rubens's first wife. Here, I would suggest, is a man easy with himself, one who's going to find it easy, too, to get on with people. Indeed, by the time this was painted in Antwerp in 1609, Rubens was surrounded by friends. Rubens made friendships earlier, and he made them often. The first of these, about which we rarely know anything, and we know a lot, was with Balthasar Moretus. It began when the two boys were pupils at the Latin school under the shadow of the Cathedral of Our Lady in Antwerp. Rubens was the son of a disgraced civil servant whose affair with his employer's wife, Anna of Saxony, not only ruined his career, but made of his family refugees. Outcasts as that family became, it had found itself cast out upon the quayside of the River Scheldt when it arrived in Antwerp from Cologne in 1587. By contrast to the uncertain status of the Rubens family, Balthasar Moretus, whom you see here, belonged securely to an elite which had helped to make of Antwerp one of the most famous cities in Europe. Balthasar was the second generation of a family in the business of what had become, by 1600, the most prestigious publishing house in Europe. Success had been achieved by Jan, father of Balthasar, going into partnership with Christoph Plantin, the famous Northern Renaissance publisher. The joint enterprise of Plantin and Moretus had rapidly achieved a status in Antwerp, such as the house of John Murray would later come to enjoy in 19th century London. But whereas the staple of Murray's was guidebooks to Europe for the newly enfranchised railway traveller, that of the Plantin Moretus business had been the monopoly of printing Catholic service books, which surprisingly perhaps were issued at this time not from Rome, but from the Moretus press in Antwerp. But then what did this friendship mean between the stateless Peter Paul Rubens and Balthasar Moretus, the son of a hugely wealthy printer? Much, it would seem, if the present Rubens sent Moretus as anything to go by. About 1630, Rubens designed two book plates, one for Moretus and another for his business partner, Jan Moretus. For Moretus, we have the dividers signifying a capacity to measure and to judge, supported by Hercules as labour and a female as constancy. For Moretus, Rubens was altogether more light-hearted. He avoided the sermon with the device of a sitting hen and the word incubando. Beyond these nice little conceits, Rubens enhanced Moretus's books by revolutionizing the design of title pages. For the first 10 years of his collaboration with Plantin Moretus, the artist designed conventional architectural style title pages, seen most effectively in the Jesuit Franciscus Aguilonius's Opticorum Libri Sex of 1613. This is a handsome design, well integrated, with its beautiful précis of contents, and as such, pleasing to eye and mind alike. However, suddenly in 1617, and with two title pages, Rubens transformed what had been an architectonic structure into one where artist is thinking as a painter. The title page for Boccio's Crux Triumphans et Gloriosa and Lessius de Justitia et Jure, published within 2 months of each other in the summer of 1617, herald a quite new conception in book design. With these two title pages, Rubens overturned convention to achieve the ideal, unified, dramatic 17th century integration of architecture, painting, and sculpture, which looks forward to and might even have inspired the works of Bernini. It was an exceptional achievement for the history of the book, more important for the reputation of Rubens at large than the circumstances of its creation might lead us to believe. As a master of graphic art associated with some great publishing successes, his creativity became available on an annual basis via a hub vastly more effective as a sales outlet than mere print shops. Moretus's books were prominently on display at the annual Frankfurt Book Fair, then as now the principal outlet for book sales in Europe. As booksellers made their annual pilgrimage to that South German city, they not only observed a transformation in the format of the title page, but saw that all these splendid portals to knowledge were subscribed with the Latin tag down there, Rubens Invenit. The association of Rubens with the Plantin Moretus publishing house gave him free advertising. But more importantly, it brought his name to the attention of antiquaries, churchmen, scientists, jurists, and philologists, in short, to the most generous possible European readership. Now, just because somebody reads widely does not mean an interest in pictures. Far from it. However, what I am suggesting is that through the association Rubens enjoyed with a variety of texts, ecclesiastical, historical, archaeological, or whatever, he was constantly drawing attention to himself, amongst what historians of early modern Europe have termed the Republic of Letters. His election into this brotherhood, no less important than the Jesuits to progressive intellectual endeavour in early modern Europe, was critical for his success. The creative presence of Rubens within hard covers encouraged contact with some of the finest minds in Europe. Such access, albeit long distance, bore fruit in epistolary exchange, and thereafter epistolary friendship. So we have seen, therefore, how the earliest friendship of Rubens we know about, his boyhood relationship with Balthasar Moretus, proved exceptionally fruitful. As another close friend put it, how fortunate is our city of Antwerp to have as her two leading citizens Rubens and Moretus. Foreigners will gaze at the houses of both, and tourists will admire them. And so it remains to this day. Foreigners and tourists are still visiting the houses of Moretus and Rubens. What then of Rubens as a letter writer, the primary means whereby he was to keep his European friendships in good repair? We are fortunate to have as many as 250 written by this most public of painters but private of men. That is to say, more than any other painter of the classical tradition. What is their nature, and how did Rubens use his correspondence as counters in a game of self-promotion? Almost to a letter, his epistles are public. None survives to either of his wives or any of his children. Surely these once existed, but may have been destroyed after his death in May 1640 by his second wife when she remarried. But the other meaning of public is more positive than the regretted absence of the familial dimension. His letters have what Rubens's friend, the French savant Nicolas Fabry de Peiresc, in another context, described as a marvelous reserve. If this description can be applied to Rubens, and I believe it perfectly characterizes his epistolary style, what exactly does it mean? His letters are by turns vivacious, courteous, acute, and through their limpid economy, evidence of the powers of his mind. Very rarely are they what we would describe as intimate, a word I am reluctant to employ since Rubens would have considered its use in this context as frankly both incomprehensible, if not reprehensible. The point is that eruditi and uomini illustri, and Rubens belonged to both circles, new letters would be passed round to be savoured as a kind of literature. Because these letters were common currency, the art of construction was also the art of promotion. Peiresc, the acknowledged master in 17th century Europe of the epistolary art, had once declared of the ambitious letter writer that such a man, I quote, could not know how to march too softly when it is a question of insinuating oneself into the good graces of men. Rubens took this to heart because he succeeded through letter writing in finding his way into the good graces of friends in the Low Countries, Spain, France, Italy, the Empire, and England. In all these places, recipients frequently acted either as intercessors for Rubens or, when necessary, apologists for him with princes of state and church. Underpinning epistolary exchange was a shared philosophical outlook. The Republic of Letters was sustained by an arch of ethics built upon the twin pillars of Christianity and pagan philosophy. Now, the keystone of that arch was Neo-Stoicism, whose prime interpreter had been Justus Lipsius, the most celebrated teacher of classics in the 17th century, and one famously commemorated by Rubens in this group portrait. Neo-Stoicism helped these friends to live rightly. Neo-Stoicism created a common outlook, regardless of what type of Christianity or political system any of Rubens's correspondents subscribed to. These friends, actors in what Lipsius, in his edition of Tacitus, describes as the theatre of today's life, all believed in values transcending the brutal realities of a violent age of religious extremism. To illustrate how this shared outlook transcended political and religious differences, we could do no better than consider Rubens's dealings with Hugo Grotius, the famous luminary of Holland. Today, Grotius is largely remembered only by lawyers as the creator of international law. But Grotius did far more. Attached to a Dutch embassy to France at the tender age of 15, he so impressed Henry IV that this French king described him as the wonder of Holland. I should just explain, in case anybody doesn't know, the United Provinces is modern-day Holland, and the Spanish Netherlands is modern-day Belgium. Afterwards, Grotius, like Rubens, worked to ameliorate the savagery of the 30 Years' War. Edward Gibbon greatly admired him, an admiration which shines through Gibbon's essay on the study of literature, where he writes, "All antiquity was known to Grotius, a knowledge that enabled him to unfold the sacred oracles, to combat ignorance and superstition, to soften the calamities, and to mitigate the horrors of war." Rubens, too, knew all about the horrors of war, for he famously painted them, a painting which uniquely has, so to speak, a letter attached to it from Rubens in which he explains symbolism in Grotian terms. At their separate stations and by different means, both Rubens and Grotius strove to achieve peace in their time. However, what is significant is that their shared ethical standpoint allowed two important representatives of regimes wholly opposed to one another to transcend differences as they pursued the same goals. Grotius was the leading intellectual of the United Provinces, fighting to throw off rule by the Spanish Netherlands, a regime which Rubens represented as Secretary of the Council of the Netherlands. But if Grotius was for Protestantism and the United Provinces, whilst Rubens was for Catholicism and the Spanish Netherlands, each was for the other. Though there is no extant correspondence between them, we certainly know they admired each other. When writing to a friend in Paris, where Grotius was then in exile, Rubens went out of his way to pay homage to Grotius by asking his correspondent to kiss the hand of the revered Dutch scholar. Of course, it may be that both men were what Frances Yates once described Rubens as having been in her essay entitled The Spirit of Chivalry. In that, Yates had called Rubens, and I quote, the supremely Burgundian humanist, locating the values Rubens espoused in the late 15th century. That is to say, to a time when the Low Countries had not been divided, nor indeed polarized by the disastrous scorched earth policies of the Duke of Alba, when in the 1560s, some 30 years before Rubens was born, Alva had been the representative of a recrudescent Spanish religious intolerance. In any event, with Rubens and Grotius, what we can fairly take to be in the respect between distinguished representatives of regimes bitterly at war with one another suggests how Rubens and his friends were able to sustain that axiom fundamental to the Republic of Letters, great is the world, but it is one state. But in another way, the aim of humanists such as Rubens and Grotius was, as Pierre Gassendi declared, I quote, to become like Socrates, a citizen, not of one country only, but of the whole world. It was because Rubens managed to remain above factionalism that he was able to move effortlessly from celebrating the Jesuits in their great church in Antwerp to extolling the immortal memory of James VI and I, a king who, as an Episcopalian, was equally hostile to Calvinism and Catholicism. The sense in which it was felt amongst savants that there should be more to unite than divide in our world is perhaps why Rubens used a design for the Jesuit church in Antwerp on the left as his matrix for the right, the union of the crowns of England and Scotland, on the ceiling of the banqueting house in Whitehall. Why, for that matter, he could be highly critical of princes or indeed whole nations, whilst doing all he could to sustain them and their rule. For example, he dismissed Spaniards as inflexible, stupid, and indolent, national characteristics he felt were decisive in preventing peace between the Spanish Netherlands and the United Provinces. As for Charles Stuart, Charles I, Rubens believed that here was a well-intentioned man led astray by what Rubens described as the arrogance and caprice of the Duke of Buckingham, the king's favourite. But despite the strong contempt in which Rubens held Buckingham, that did not prevent Rubens from immortalizing him in a splendid ceiling after Buckingham's assassination in August 1628. Making money as a painter in the 17th century was a hazardous business. The work for the banqueting house, commissioned in September 1621, was finally paid off only in 1638. Notwithstanding, Rubens certainly lived like a prince, something he owed most to his achievements, obviously with brush and palette, but also in no small part to skills with pen and paper. Now, if there was one friendship which turned paper into gold, it was with Sir Dudley Carlton, Viscount Dorchester. Rubens had first got to know Carlton when he was appointed ambassador to the United Provinces in March 1616. Carlton was the most gifted English diplomat of his generation who rose to become Secretary of State to Charles I. Carlton was a man of parts and a man of plenitude. He had the poet John Donne stay with him at the embassy in The Hague for 10 days over Christmas 1617. And at that very moment, during the Christmas season, while Carlton was talking to Donne, he was also talking to Rubens, in the sense that he was pursuing Rubens with an offer of a diamond chain worth £50 in exchange for a colossal painting, a hunting piece, 10 feet by 7 feet. That massive picture may have been this. What bound together Rubens and Carlton was a shared passion for collecting art, something Carlton had developed when ambassador in Venice before his posting to The Hague. This, of course, endeared him to Rubens, and an abiding friendship sprang up between the two men. Soon they had done a deal. Carlton swapped his antique statues acquired in Venice for paintings by Rubens, including the Prometheus, with which this lecture began, Daniel in the Lion's Den, and a Susanna and the Elders, which Carlton declared should make even an old man amorous. However, the exchange then became strained. Carlton declared the pictures were overpriced, while for his part Rubens protested that his friend had acquired the flower of his stock. Since, however, both were consummate diplomats, matters were adjusted to their mutual satisfaction. Having come close through their exchange of art, Carlton was asked by Rubens to intercede with the Dutch States General to get them to protect his intellectual property, the copyright in prints created by Rubens in Antwerp for the voracious Dutch market. Interestingly enough, here is an echo of a still more famous dispute between Dürer and his plagiarists. Just over a century earlier, the famous German artist had inserted into the colophons of the 1511 editions of the Life of the Virgin, the small as well as the large Passion, and the second edition of the Apocalypse. "Woe to you," Dürer had said, "you thieves and imitators of other people's labour and talents. Beware of laying your audacious hand on this artwork." Rubens was rather more ironic, merely writing to Carlton on May the 28th, 1619, "Most excellent sir, the reasons alleged by the States General for not helping me, or the reason is that I am neither their subject nor resident in their states. But this is not of such consequence, for other princes or republics have never made this claim. To them it seemed just to provide that their subject do no wrong or injury to any other person by infringing upon the work of others. Besides, all potentates, however divided among themselves in greater matters, are usually of one accord in favouring and protecting the virtues, sciences, and arts. At least they ought to be. The details of my application I have sent to that friend who will give your Excellency a most minute report. In the meantime, I beg you to lend a hand to the enterprise until its successful conclusion." The flattery with which this letter is lauded seems to have worked. Carlton did battle for the rights of his friend. The privilege which Rubens thus obtained from the Dutch States General to protect his prince, and as a direct result of friendship with Carlton, helped to make him indecently wealthy. By way of gratitude, Rubens then dedicated one of his truly great prints to Carlton, in which he described his friend as pictoriae artis egregio admiratori. This successful campaign, which Rubens orchestrated with Carlton, coincided with a great flowering of the Rubens print. Whereas in the previous decade, Rubens had largely dedicated his prints to the illustrious of Antwerp and the churchmen of Flanders, he began to cast his net much further afield. Now prints become and are dedicated promiscuously. Susanna and the Elders was offered to the famous Dutch emancipated poetess Anne Roma Fischer, celebrated in Amsterdam as a paradigm of virtue and wisdom. Further afield, the English Countess of Arundel was the dedicee of the largest and most ambitious of all Rubens's prints, the Battle of the Amazons. Here, subject and dedicee were perhaps better matched. Lady Arundel was fawnable, as we may sense in her portrait painted by Rubens in Brussels in August 1620, with Carlton standing behind her. We see the Countess and her children on their way to hiring a palace on the Grand Canal in Venice, she on an extended sabbatical from her marriage. Sadly, history does not, however, relate how she took to being associated with the Amazons. Just over a year after Carlton had got the Dutch government to protect Rubens's copyright, the painter turned to the French market. On the 25th of October, 1619, Peiresc, whom we have met already, responded to a request that he do for Rubens what Carlton had done for him in The Hague. Thus began a friendship which yielded the highest return of all in terms of Rubens's fame as a painter, as opposed to any financial gain. In February 1622, Rubens embarked on the hardest pictorial challenge of his entire career. He signed the contract to celebrate in 24 canvases the life of Marie de' Medici, Queen and Regent of Louis XIII. Rubens was asked to flatter Marie, although her regency can well be described as a disaster in 24 episodes. As if that task was not hard enough, Rubens was required to insinuate what a nasty, ungrateful young man her son, Louis XIII, was. Then, throughout this vastly complicated endeavour, there was someone else Rubens had to contend with. That person was not only trying to seize power from Marie herself, but also wrest the commission from Rubens and give it to a painter who would be more favourably disposed towards himself. That person was Cardinal Richelieu. Just how dysfunctional the Valois family had now become had been foreseen by Henry IV, Henry of Navarre, erstwhile husband of the hapless Marie. He wrote, shortly before he'd been assassinated in 1610, to Marie in terms which must have startled even this tough old bird. He wrote, "The end of my life will be the commencement of your woes. My mistresses have displeased you, but you will find it very difficult to avoid being mistreated some day by those who will take over Louis's mind. Of one thing I can assure you, given the temperament I know you have, and foreseeing what his will be, you all over again, pig-headed to say it outright, madame, and he headstrong, the two of you will well and truly be at each other's throats." That Rubens succeeded with this impossible commission owes as much to his friendship with our old acquaintance Peiresc as to any amount of skill with brushes. Scores of letters written in Italian passed between Antwerp and Paris, though most were used for lighting fires by Peiresc's niece after his death in 1637. Never mind, we still have enough. What, therefore, do they show? With regard to the Medici cycle, Peiresc acted as something between a personal assistant, a special advisor to a politician, and a coach to a tennis superstar. Emollient, tactful, shrewd, forthright, and ever alert, Peiresc was such a tireless friend that quite simply the commission was a triumph for him, as it was more obviously for Rubens. For example, a difficulty arose early in the proceedings. Marie was assembling a record of her new Palais du Luxembourg, of which the Rubens cycle was merely a part. So she let it be known that she would like some of the sketches Rubens had prepared for the finished pictures. Rubens was not happy, whereupon Peiresc suggested he might send copies. Apparently this was no good either, as Peiresc had to explain to a Queen Regent who was unmollified, who remained unmollified. Peiresc wrote, "You see, there is a real danger that a copyist will betray weaknesses which will then be attributed to Rubens, and he doesn't like that idea at all." However, Peiresc was no hapless go-between. Far from it. He was central to the whole genesis of the project and its successful realization. Perhaps most importantly, he relayed messages between Rubens himself and Salomon de Brosse, the architect of the great new palace, into which these 24 pictures were to be inserted. There was the fiendishly difficult business of conveying to Rubens in Antwerp how de Brosse in Paris was intending to light the gallery into which the Rubens pictures were going to be moved. As it was, Rubens had nasty memories of either getting his measurements wrong for big commissions or wholly misjudging how light could nullify his best endeavours. Many years earlier, he had had the mortification of having his finest Italian altarpiece politely returned on the grounds that it was invisible when hung in its intended location because he had not taken account of the lighting. So, to revert to the Medici cycle, as ideas came flooding through to Peiresc from Rubens, he scrutinized them forensically for anachronisms, but still more importantly, for details likely to create offence. Thus, with the marriage by proxy in Florence Cathedral, Peiresc pointed out what he saw as the solecism in Rubens' sketch of having Cardinal Aldobrandini's hat parked on the high altar of Florence Cathedral. And he wrote, at his entry into the cathedral, the cardinal would certainly have had his hat on, but once he was celebrating the marriage, he put the sign of his office on a small altar near the main one, together with other ornaments proper to his rank. Therefore, I want you to find a little spot in your picture for this small altar, and on it you must place the hat. On this occasion, Rubens quietly ignored what might be thought to have been the pedantic scruples of an antiquarian. However, on many others, advice was gratefully received and effectively acted upon. Peiresc not merely squinted at pictures, his eyeballs positively rotated as he tracked the fluctuations of court faction. For whilst painting for Mary, Rubens was concurrently involved in a massive commission for Louis XIII, the unpleasant son. In 1624, Rubens sent cartoons to be woven in Paris for a tapestry cycle depicting the life of Constantine the Great. Peiresc hurried down to the tapestry factory to be in time to see Rubens's cartoons for the tapestries emerging from their packing cases. He was most anxious to gauge the reaction of Marie de Medici's high priest of art, the Abbé de Saint-Ambroise. Happily, the Abbé liked what he saw, and immediately Peiresc hurried off a letter to Rubens. You are now under a great obligation to the Abbé. I strongly advise you to send him a couple of lines of thanks. And so it was that Peiresc guided Rubens through the thickets of French politics. It is no wonder then that Rubens sent a self-portrait down to Peiresc house in Provence, promising to visit him where his friend had retired from the tumults of Paris. So, to recap, I've been arguing that Rubens used both his correspondence and the dedications on his prints to extend friendships which helped him to define his values, sustain his life, and promote his career. However, if the Rubens hand was extended in friendship, the Rubens fist grasped whatever opportunities amity could offer. Through friendship and the well-chosen dedication, Rubens made himself noticed and he made himself wanted. But then, as Rubens always knew it would, fortune turned against him. In August 1625, his first wife Isabella died, probably of the plague. The letter in which Rubens described his grief at the death of Isabella comes closest of all to breaking that equability which was one of the secrets of his success. Rubens confessed that even his long-practiced stoicism was not going to be sufficient to withstand such a blow. His remedy was to distract grief by expanding public life. So it was that between 1626 and 1634, he embarked on years of shuttle diplomacy. During that time, he brokered peace between Spain and England, acquired knighthoods from the kings of Spain and Great Britain, and from his house in Bethnal Green, proceeded up to Cambridge, where the university conferred an honorary degree upon him. I like to think that he had time to pop into King's Chapel to see the finest display of Northern Renaissance art in Britain, with those acres of stained glass, joined, of course, in our own lifetime, as that glass has been, by one of his own pictures on the high altar. Wealth Rubens pursued, riches he came to enjoy. Fame and public honours, however, he said farewell to, though he confessed that stepping out of the public arena was one of the hardest things he ever had to do. His visit to the Archduchess Isabella, ruler of the Spanish Netherlands, to implore her to release him from public life, he describes thus: I threw myself at the feet of Her Highness and begged as the sole reward for so many efforts, exemption from further assignments, and this favour I obtained with more difficulty than any other she ever granted me. Rubens demonstrated habitual reserve, intimate acquaintance with the expository text of Neo-Stoicism, exchanged ideas through correspondence with European intellectuals, all in the service of ambitions painterly and political. However, now at the end of the lecture, there is another path which ran parallel to the stony and elevated track along which we have pursued him tonight, and I want to look at this. This became Rubens's preferred route when, once free, he retired to his country estates near Malines or Mechlin. This less strenuous way was one in which gentilezza, an amorous exchange, was foregrounded, giving room to that innate sociability for which the painter was famous. Once unburdened of the demands of state, Rubens was able to role-play, dependent upon precepts first articulated in the modern world by Baldassare Castiglione in his book Il Cortegiano. With Rubens's remarriage in December 1630, his retirement from public life in 1634, and his acquisition of his country estate, Hetstein, near Malines, in May 1635, he came to inhabit the world of the beaux esprits. An altogether more dulcet approach to life than the precepts of Lipsius, such douceur de vivre is perfectly exemplified by that mysterious painting, the so-called Garden of Love. In this, we see Rubens with his second wife here, and perhaps some of their Antwerp friends out from the city for a day in the country. I rather suspect that in these last years divided between Antwerp and Malines, the old master hugely enjoyed himself. Sadly, however, we know all too little about how Rubens spent his days at Hetstein. I suspect, however, it was a consciously contrived retreat based upon literary evocations of a lifestyle which had been made famous in Italy in the 16th century by Raphael Borghini, in which repose was the name of the imaginary villa where the author located his dialogue, Il Riposo, of 1584. Thus, Hetstein looked to the past as it approximated to current fashions for country life. For at this time in Holland, and doubtless too in the Spanish Netherlands, there were castles with names such as Pass the Time, Without Care, and Buitenzorg, anticipating Frederick the Great's famous Sans Souci in the 18th century. At Hetstein, life might have been played out as one sustained charade, with Rubens by turn masquerading as country squire and even as a wagoner, and I always like to think this is a self-portrait, off to market in the early autumn sunshine, and it's Hetstein, his house, at the background now. At Hetstein, indeed, life might have been, Rubens, however, had only 5 years to enjoy the relative peace of life spent commuting between his townhouse in Antwerp and Hetstein, a mere 20 miles away. Not that he simply pottered around his farm, far from it. In a letter of April the 2nd, 1638, 2 years before he died, he declared that he would paint a great altarpiece for Cologne Cathedral, although I am overwhelmed with work. A week before he died, no less, he was negotiating with Henrietta Maria of England to paint ceilings at the Queen's House in Greenwich. Although he was impresario for the great state entry of the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand into Antwerp as the new ruler of the Spanish Netherlands, as late as April 1635, gout had confined him to bed on the day itself. Thus, he had been unable to watch the procession with its 11 stages of welcome, all designed by him as the homage of the city of Antwerp to greet what all hoped would be their saviour. But if Rubens couldn't come to the party came to him. The Cardinal Infante called at his house after his entry to thank him personally for the splendid reception. Rubens died on May the 20th, 1640. He is buried in St. James's, Antwerp, in the floor of the choir beneath the protection of his own altarpiece. Upon the slab which marks his grave is a Latin epitaph composed by Jan Caspar Gevaerts, clerk of the city of Antwerp, Gevaerts had originally introduced Rubens to Peiresc, and it was to Gevaerts Rubens had entrusted the education of his eldest son Albert when he'd been wandering the roads and seas of northern Europe. The Gevaerts inscription consists of 19 full lines. What is intriguing, however, is that nowhere are the words painter or painting mentioned. Admittedly, buried in the middle of this high-flown biography is the laconic aside, Apelles dixit meruit, meaning he deserved to be called Apelles. That's it. Reference to the most famous of all painters, Apelles, the legendary artist and companion of Alexander the Great. That, however, is all we have about what went on inside the famous two-story studio in which kings and their servants had been entertained so lavishly. Just 3 Latin words referring obliquely to what I have suggested at the beginning of this lecture was this uniquely productive painter. But whilst we may be astonished that so little is made of Rubens the artist in his epitaph, it would seem that others were not. No one, as far as we know, amongst the several orders of the poor, the 120 orphaned boys who held the torches for the evening interment of Rubens, the canons regular and the choir of the Collegiate Church of St. James's, the chief officers of the city and the members of the Academy of Painting appear to have been upset by what seems to us such an extraordinary omission. Evidently, for his contemporaries, it was Rubens as the representative of the civility of Flanders which mattered most. It was a point made by Gevaerts himself, who, as a distinguished historian, was able to see Rubens as the last of the Burgundians and thereby set him in the context of a vanishing civilization. This is surely suggested by what comes immediately after these 3 words, Apelles dixit meruit. What follows is this, atque ad regum principumque virorum amicitias gradum sibi fecit, which translated means, he made for himself a step to the friendships of kings and princely men. It would seem that Gevaerts, who knew Rubens so well, knew also just how important the art of friendship had been to this Promethean figure. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for that very erudite and beautifully delivered lecture. I'm sure that we all really enjoyed that. There's now a reception next door in the Lorimer room, which is out of this door, up and into the next steps, to which you're all welcome. But before we leave, I'd like you to join me again in thanking David for his inaugural lecture. Thank you.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.